welcome to Sprott Radio. I'm your host, Ed Coyne, Senior Managing Partner at Sprott. I'm pleased to welcome Doug Sandridge, Senior Vice President at Fulcrum Energy. Doug, thank you for joining me today on Sprott Radio.
What a fantastic treat. I can't wait.
Well, Doug, you have over 40 years of experience in petroleum and land management. And I'm excited about this because I just finished watching the first season of Landman. So I feel like I get to talk to a real landman today, which is going to be really fun. So, I want to start with really unpacking kind of your history and background, both from a personal standpoint, but also from a professional standpoint, and kind of walk us through how you found yourself in this field and some of the experiences you've gone through over the 4+ decades now.
Yeah, it's actually approaching 5 now. I was looking the other day and noticed that I started my first job in the oil and gas business in August of 1975. So that means August of this year will be my 50th anniversary in oil and gas. But I was really born into the oil and gas industry. My dad graduated from University of Oklahoma with a degree in geological engineering, and he had to do his service in the Army. And I was born in an Army hospital while he was doing his service. But shortly after that, like 6 weeks after I was born, then he got a job in the oil and gas business, worked for Phillips Petroleum for almost 40 years. And we started to travel around like the nomads that oil and gas people often are, especially geologists. And I moved 26 times in my first 26 years of life. But we moved around the U.S. quite a bit, Texas and Colorado and Oklahoma. And then in 1966, my dad got an opportunity to go overseas. Phillips Petroleum, which is a pretty substantial independent oil company now, ConocoPhillips. But at the time, it was, they were sort of limited in what they did overseas. They weren't a huge international company at the time. And they made a big play to go into the North Sea. And they had one of the iconic discoveries of all time, the Ekofisk discovery in Norway, after over 200 wells had been drilled in the North Sea, and 37 in Norway, I believe, had been drilled, all dry holes, before they found this iconic field. And Phillips really took off as a result of that. But anyway, as a child, I lived all over the place. And actually, when you talk about landman, ironically, I finished my high school in Midland, Texas. So after having lived overseas my whole life, it was quite a culture shock to come finish high school in Midland. But, Midland is near and dear to my heart. And I went to University of Oklahoma. And mainly, there was 2 reasons why I went to University of Oklahoma. Well, several reasons. My parents, my mom and dad both were graduates there, and they wanted me to go there. But my parents were going to be transferred back overseas. I'd been in Midland for a couple of years, and they were going to be transferred overseas. They thought it made sense for me to go to school near family, and I had my grandparents in Oklahoma. So that was another good reason. And the third reason I started Oklahoma was, if your parents live overseas, how do you get in-state tuition? I mean, if they live in Abu Dhabi, I guess you get in-state tuition in Abu Dhabi, but my parents wanted me to have in-state tuition, and it turns out at that time in Oklahoma, I don't know if it's the same now, but at that time in Oklahoma University would grant in-state tuition to anyone whose parents were living overseas and working for an Oklahoma-based company.
Interesting.
So since Phillips Petroleum was in Oklahoma, then I got in-state tuition even though my parents were going to live in England. So for those reasons, I went to University of Oklahoma. I really wanted to be an architect. And I just hate to say it, but I looked around and saw all my friends in architecture, and they had no social life at all. It was so much work. It was one of those degrees where you spent all your time working on projects and drawings, and you never could go to parties and doing everything. So after my first year as an architecture major, I decided I loved architecture, but I wasn't going to devote my whole life and not live the college experience. So I transferred into engineering, which was my dad's dream for me. And I had to declare a type of engineering. And I had no idea what I wanted to do, but it sounded neat to declare nuclear engineering. So I declared my major as nuclear engineering. And honestly, I had not grown up my whole life thinking, oh, I want to be a fireman or a nuclear engineer, whatever. It wasn't like that at all. And then my sophomore year, so I'm dating myself. So in April of my sophomore year, the 3 Mile Island accident happened in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And we all know nuclear energy had already been on a downward trajectory for about a decade in the US and Canada already. But the release of Jane Fonda's The China Syndrome, followed immediately by the accident at 3 Mile Island, really were big nails in the coffin of nuclear energy at that time. And so I transferred over into oil and gas at that time. I got a degree in petroleum land management, and I spent my entire career doing that.
Well, it's amazing. You talk about, being kind of at the forefront and with nuclear. I'm smiling and laughing about that. We just had I guess about a month or so ago, we had Gabriel Ivory on, who is a senior at Texas A&M studying nuclear engineering, and it's amazing how life goes full circle. Multiple generations. I think nuclear is becoming cool again. People are talking about it again. So if you stick around long enough, you get back into vogue. So reading your bio, I would have thought that nuclear was a newer initiative for you because you have so much oil and gas experience. So that's fascinating that you studied nuclear engineering in college. That's really cool.
Yeah, and so honestly, you get out of college, you got a career, you're trying to climb up the corporate ladder, you got a new wife, you got family. I didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about nuclear energy during that period of time. And really, what got me re engaged in nuclear energy was Robert Bryce. He has done more for energy education than just about anybody. And I listened to his podcast religiously. And he and I were friends, but not great friends at that time. And every week he would do a podcast once a week. When they closed Indian Point, he was so angry. He did 4 podcasts in a row, and he called it Indian Point Blackout Week. And he was just on a rant for 4 days about how silly it was to close Indian Point. And by the time I finished listening to those 4 episodes, I was ready to run through a brick wall to save nuclear power plants. And so I decided at that point, so that's would be April, I think, or May of 2021. I decided, okay, how am I going to get involved? And one of the people that he interviewed was a really interesting fella named Mark Nelson. I don't know if you know Mark.
I don't.
He's a great nuclear engineering advocate here in the U.S. Great friend of Chris Kiefer, your own homegrown nuclear advocate there in Canada. But I heard him speak so passionately that I found him on LinkedIn or Twitter someplace and reached out. And he got me involved. He said, okay, if you're serious about this, then I'm going to get you involved with Save Diablo Canyon, Save Palisades, And he even invited me to go with him to Berlin to a rally to kind of shame the Germans for shutting down their last nuclear power plant. So that's when I got re-engaged in 2021. Indian Point was the point.
Well, Diablo Canyon, we've had Heather Hoft on our podcast. And I know you know her as well and have worked with her, of course, if you were involved with that. So, let's hear it from your side of the table, because she gave us she has a fascinating background, the way she grew up and how she got involved with that project and just working there. But what was your experience in going through that? What did you learn when you were trying to save this plant?
So let's be clear. I was just an appendage on the side.
Okay.
I was learning. I got involved, and kind of the story is California had a rich nuclear history for a long time, and even at the beginning, organizations like Sierra Club and other organizations really supported nuclear energy because they felt like it was so environmentally preferable to the alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
And so early 60s and early 70s, California was building nuclear power plants. They had test reactors there. They had all sorts of stuff going on. But all of a sudden, the tide turned. Sierra Club decided that us humans were not mature enough to handle the prosperity that was going to be created by abundant nuclear energy. And so they started to oppose nuclear energy. And California was one of those states that went all in. By 2013, they'd already closed all of their nuclear power plants except San Onofre and Diablo Canyon.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2013, California Edison, that they closed San Onofre. And then under continual pressure from the public and the governor, they announced in 2016, I believe in May of 2016, May or June, sometime in early 2016, they announced they were closing Diablo Canyon. And it was at that time, right before that, Heather and some of her other colleagues had noticed subtle changes at the plant, which gave them kind of confirmed what they already believed, and that was that the plant was going to not relicense for future.
Right.
And so they started Mothers for Nuclear. They paired up with Stand Up for Nuclear, Isabel Bemeke, all these other organizations. And it was kind of a hard road from 2016 to 2018. It was pretty grim because the institutions of California were so anti-nuclear, the governor's office, everybody. And so when I finally got hooked up with them, I had not done advocacy. So I essentially sat on the sidelines and listened and learned what is it like to advocate? How do you advocate for something like this? I'd never done grassroots advocacy work. I listened and saw what they were doing and learned. Occasionally I threw a little money, towards it, but I mean,
Right.
honestly, I was just a fly on the wall trying to learn the trade. And I did not think that there was any chance that they would save that plant. I just thought in California, they were too dug in their anti-nuclear position. Of course, there's nothing like a good brownout or blackout to change people's
Right.
minds.
Right. You're anti, you're anti something until all of a sudden it starts affecting your day-to-day life.
And as good as all the great work that Heather and her partners and Stand Up for Nuclear and Generation Atomic and Isabel Bemeke, the great work all of them did, I'm not sure that they would have saved it had they not started to have blackouts. But they positioned themselves to pounce on that. So once that started to happen, then they started to give the politicians the oxygen and the information necessary for them to change their minds. They gave, they were their position to provide them with that information. And eventually, I believe over 2/3 of the legislature in California voted, to keep Diablo Canyon open. That, to me, was a lesson of what grassroots advocacy can do. And I'm trying to take that same spirit to doing some advocacy in Colorado and Texas now. But I have to say, I was not a believer at the time. I just thought I was working on a great cause that really didn't have a future, and they proved me wrong. They did such a great job.
I want to talk about something that's near and dear to your heart that I guess is a couple years old now, the oil and gas executives for nuclear, talking about getting involved. I think that's fascinating because at Sprott, we've only been really talking about nuclear in a meaningful way the last couple of years, 3 to 5 years. And this whole thing of the perception is it was oil and gas versus nuclear or oil and gas versus solar and so forth. And the reality is we need it all. And we need it all in different ways, shapes, and forms. We need it all in certain parts of the world more than other parts of the world because of access and so forth. But walk us through why oil and gas executives for nuclear. What's behind that? What's driving that?
Since we've already talked about Heather, and she's such a great friend for you guys and for me. In fact, I was just out and had dinner with Heather a couple of weeks before Christmas. I had the great opportunity to go out to Diablo Canyon.
Oh, cool.
And so I met Heather in person for the first time. I had known her, on WhatsApp chats and calls for several years, and we had talked by phone many times. So we were on a phone call, and so one of the things that Stand Up for Nuclear did is they started a WhatsApp group where they would invite anybody who is interested in advocacy for Diablo Canyon. They would invite them to join this group, and it was a way for them to communicate with each other, hear about events, react to calls for action. Hey, we need to go out to the Capitol today and show our support. We need to call our senators, whatever the case may be. And so I joined that WhatsApp group. And as I said, I don't want to act like I was really involved. I was involved because I would get on the phone and I would sit and listen to all that was going on and listening and learning. I rarely said very much, partly because I wasn't in California, partly because I was a neophyte. I didn't know what I was doing. And partly it wasn't my fight as much as it was a fight for the people of California. And so I did that for a couple of years, and we'd have our weekly call on Tuesday. But I was also looking for a purpose for my advocacy. You can listen to the calls, you can go to Berlin, you can do a few things, but I was thinking, what can I do to really move the needle on nuclear advocacy? So we're on a phone call. So I'm going to call out Heather. She doesn't remember this, but we're going to call out Heather. For some reason, during the phone call, she says, well, we know you oil and gas guys hate nuclear energy. And we know that your industry undermines our industry and has done so for a long time. And I was like, okay, I got to take myself off of mute. I can't take that sitting still. And so I took off mute and I said, I just have to push back. I think you're wrong. I don't know where that narrative has come from. Maybe that was true in the 50s. Maybe it was true in the 60s. But it's certainly not true now. And I said, I don't know anyone in my industry who's anti-nuclear. And I said, of course, I don't know all 4 million employees in the US, but I know a heck of a lot of them. And I really believe that the vast, vast majority of oil and gas people support nuclear energy because I believe oil and gas people are generally sober about energy. They understand good energy. They understand energy that's not so good. They understand the inherent limitations of certain types of energy. And so I think oil and gas people can respectfully respect what nuclear energy brings to society. Even though it's not our industry, we're big enough. We can stand up and support somebody else's industry. So I had that idea. I said, maybe this is what I can do to help the advocacy. Maybe one thing I can do to help nuclear is to dispel this myth that oil and gas people are anti-nuclear. Now,
Mm-hmm.
obviously, there's somebody somewhere, and maybe there's an organization somewhere that I'm not aware of, but I just think it's untrue. So I mulled on that for a little while. And then I thought, okay, what I think I'm going to do is I know a lot of people. I'm going to put together a declaration of support for nuclear energy and explain why energy is important and explain why nuclear energy is important and explain why oil and gas people are strong enough in their own skin to stand up and support nuclear energy. And then I thought, I'm I'm a nobody. What am I doing here? Who's going to listen to me and who's going to sign this thing? So I texted Chris Wright and I told him what I wanted to do. Chris Wright, our new Secretary of Energy,
Mm-hmm.
and Chris is a busy guy and he doesn't always call me or text me back immediately. He's on his own schedule. But pretty quickly, maybe within an hour or less, he texted me back, says, I love this idea. Let's do it. So we drafted this declaration for oil and gas executives for nuclear in support of nuclear energy. And at one point, it was as long as 6 pages. Realized nobody's going to read 6 pages.
Right.
At one point, it was as short as 1 page, but I didn't think I could say everything I wanted to say in 1 page. We finally settled on a 2 page declaration. Page one is all the reasons why energy is important to the world. And page two is what we need to do to support nuclear energy. And so I sent it over to Chris and sent it to his personal assistant and said, would you run this by Chris and see if this is something he would sign? About an hour later, it came back signed. He didn't change a word in it. He just
Wow.
said, that's good. So he was the first to sign it. And I was the second to sign it. And we were off to the races. And we went out and we've got about 130 or 140 signatures from executives. And there's some really big names on there. And then there's a lot of not so big names, but there's power in numbers as well. And I think that it's been an effective tool to raise awareness. And I think, if nothing else, we have really dispelled among most of the nuclear people we know, we've dispelled the myth that oil and gas people don't support nuclear energy. What I didn't know at the time is how many oil and gas companies are seeking a path into nuclear energy. And I didn't realize how important the oil and gas industry is going to be in developing nuclear energy going forward, especially the small and micro reactors.
Well, yeah, talk about that because, the infrastructure of an oil and gas company is really the key, right? You think about even coal companies, you look at current coal plants and this idea of small modular reactors coming in and getting retrofitted to a coal plant and serving the energy needs there. I got to believe that's what's driving a lot of this is saying, look, we already have the know-how, we have the geologists, we have the skills, we understand all this. This is just diversifying a portfolio. So it's not just something to do because we think it's the right thing to do. It's also a thing to do that, you can profit from and add value to, and it can finance itself. It's not some kind of tax credit. It's just being supportive of an initiative or a narrative. It actually works. By signing this, what does it actually mean when an executive says, I'm going to put my name on this also? What does that mean for them or the company they represent?
I think, to be honest, for most of the people who signed it, they didn't sign it for any other reason than I signed it. And it was that they think that we need more energy for the world. The
Mm-hmm.
world needs more energy. And we, as oil and gas executives, recognize that some of that energy, if not a lot of that energy, should and will come from nuclear energy. I don't think it was any more convoluted than that. Now, there's a
Okay.
few people in that list who actually have an invested interest in nuclear energy. I'll get to that in a minute. But I think most people just signed it because they thought it was the right thing to do. What I had no idea really at the time was how pervasive it is becoming in oil and gas industry and service companies as well to take an interest in nuclear energy. But now that, like you said, now that you think about it, it really makes sense. Now, I don't anticipate you're going to see Exxon building AP1000s, gigawatt scale can-dos or anything like that. That's not going to happen probably. That's probably different. But we've got all these small modular reactors and micro reactors, anywhere from 5 megawatts to 300 megawatts in size. Those are of the size that they could probably benefit from the skill sets that these oil and gas companies and oil and gas service companies have. These oil and gas companies know how to build big projects on time, on
Mm-hmm.
budget. They have supply chain competency. They have project management competency. They have research competency. They have manufacturing competency. They have all of these. I mean, they can build an offshore drilling rig or they could build a small modular reactor probably just as easily. The actual reactor is probably going to come from an existing technology, one of these Oklo or X or somebody. But actually, to build the plant, to take it and build the whole project, it's perfect for oil companies and for large service companies like NOV. I don't know if you guys know NOV, but
Mm-hmm.
they're very low key and low profile, but they've been around for a long, 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 long time. I'm guessing over 100 years, and they are very well respected, very well managed, and they know how to do bid projects. And this comes back to kind of the question of who signed this document and why they did or didn't. And so I was looking on through my Rolodex trying to find everybody I could that would sign this declaration. So I called a couple of people that I knew at NOV, and I said, "Hey, I got this declaration. Would you guys be interested in signing it?" Well, I was kind of miffed because not only did my friends not sign it, they wouldn't even return my calls or my emails. And I'm thinking, I thought we were friends. And
Right.
so, as I found out later, as you may know, just a year ago in January of last year, NOV announced the formation of a wholly owned subsidiary called Shepherd Power. And that company was started up by them as a division to do nothing except develop nuclear projects. So I then later found out the reason they didn't sign the declaration is they thought it'd be kind of dishonest, it'd be self-serving to sign it. They couldn't tell me that they were developing this new entity, so I respect the fact they couldn't tell me that,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't want to lie to me and pretend like they weren't doing it. So the easiest thing was just to ignore me. But I later found out that that was the reason that
Yeah.
they did that. So NOV, of course, is going to be a big player in that. As you know, Liberty Energy from Chris Wright's company, Liberty Energy is an investor in Oklo. I don't want to divulge, anything that I shouldn't, but I know many of the majors are now engaged in various levels in trying to get into the nuclear development development game.
Let's talk about Fulcrum for a minute because you guys do some really cool stuff. You're really kind of working with the smaller kind of regional types of companies out there. Tell me some of the things you guys are doing where you're having some impact and having a seat at the table. And do you see you guys crossing over more to the nuclear side of the table?
No, I don't see us crossing over to the nuclear side of the table. We're a small company that has a pretty good set of investors, family offices, money that's pretty closely held. And the people that have invested in our properties in the past are typically people who want to buy proven producing properties and see an immediate return. And so you're going to buy a property for $50 million and you're going to get X amount of revenue the first month you own it, the second month you own it, and you hope that you get your $50 million back in 2 years. maybe less, maybe a little more. So there's no right way or wrong way. It's just that we have catered to the type of investor that wants to do that. To invest in nuclear requires a completely different type of investor
Mm-hmm.
profile, a completely different timeline for recovering their money. They're looking, you're going to be investing large sums of money that you might not realize any return on for 10 years. And it's not right or wrong. And our investors that we have cultivated they want to buy properties where they get an immediate return. So I don't see us looking at nuclear energy, but we do look at things outside of core oil and gas. We've looked at we've invested in some technologies, energy related, not even necessarily oil and gas related. Looked at deals in helium and other things. So we're not 100%, but primarily that's our wheelhouse. We go find properties that we think we can acquire. We can improve the operations. We can take something that maybe was only marginally profitable for someone else, and by better operations, better back of the house, back of the office staff, by better operating techniques and management, improve the profitability of it, and then ultimately we'll normally going to sell those. We don't keep a lot of legacy properties
Mm-hmm.
for decades or anything like that. We're going to find a property, produce it, get our money back, improve it, and probably sell it at the right time.
Well, let's stay on oil and gas then for a second, because you mentioned something about technology, and I think most people out there, or most investors, or most consumers of energy, think of oil and gas as old fashioned, or fracking obviously made it relevant for a while, and people talked about that. But what are some of the technologies out there that are keeping oil and gas at the forefront as well? What are some of the cool things that the oil and gas industry are doing that maybe are sustainable, maybe are cleaner, that kind of thing? Anything out there that maybe the average listener wouldn't know about that's happening?
Sure. I mean, I think anybody that's in our industry probably already knows this, but for those of you that are listening that maybe don't know, the oil and gas industry has been incredibly innovative. And one of the things that has really happened in the last 5 years, not everywhere, and certainly not overseas, but in the U.S., we have really, really clamped down on fugitive methane emissions. And to be frank, our industry did not do a very good job of that for a long time, and some of my friends will be angry that I said that. But the reality is that we should have been doing a better job on that, and so a lot of the improvements have been forced upon us. But in Colorado, where I live, there's no more routine flaring of gas whatsoever, period. And so we've found ways to utilize the gas, found better ways to reduce leaks and that sort of thing. So that's a good thing. Now, unfortunately, we produce the cleanest molecule of natural gas and the cleanest molecule of oil anywhere in the world. And what we're doing here is not having one bit of difference on what's going on in Kazakhstan or Russia or
Right.
wherever else. But yeah, so here that's happening. Another thing is that we are developing technologies to drill and complete wells, drill and frack wells better, cheaper, more efficiently. One of those things is a lot of companies like Chris Wright's Liberty Energy are moving towards electric fleets. So that's
Mm-hmm.
good for people that are nearby, so it's quieter. That's good. But it can also be cleaner because instead of burning diesel, you're taking electricity off the grid or generating it yourself. And if you can do that, you perhaps are causing considerably less emissions by using electric fleet for both of those processes, the drilling and the completion. Now, of course, that depends on where you are. If you're plugging into a grid that's all
Right.
produced with coal, well, you're not really doing much. But if you're producing into a grid that's a lot of wind and a lot of nuclear and a lot of other alternative cleaner energies, then you really cleaned up the oil field. The other thing is that the companies have done the last few years is they've really reduced the footprint where you can drill. So, for instance, 15 years ago, you would drill a vertical well and you'd build a pad and you put a drilling rig on that pad and you drill down into the earth. And then you'd move over 600 feet and do it again, and move over 600 feet and do it again and again and again. And you can see old legacy places, even in Colorado, but particularly in Texas, where if you just took an aerial view, you'd see an oil well every 600 feet. And of course, in West Texas, it really didn't matter that much because you're just disturbing a little bit of grazing land. But as population grows and as we move oil fields into closer proximity to populated areas, that is important. So now, of course, we drill horizontal wells. And so you build a pad. And when we first were doing horizontal wells, you'd build a pad and you drill a well down, and then you drill a mile north, and then maybe if you're really on the edge of technology, you drill another well a mile south. And so from that one pad, you've developed a mile north and a mile south through this horizontal well. Well, that's fantastic. Well, now, we're in places where you put a well and you might drill 32 wells north and 32 wells south from the same pad.
Wow.
And so you're developing a large area from a single surface disturbance and a single road and a single power line. So it's really impactful. But then the next step of how impactful that is, we used to drill 1 mile north and 1 mile south. Now some of these people are drilling 2 miles. 2 miles is completely standard, maybe even a lot of people drilling now 3 miles or 4 mile laterals. So from this pad, you're drilling 4 miles north and 4 miles south. And you might be drilling, 20 or 30 wells at one time. And then the latest thing that's catching on is in an attempt to really access places, in Colorado and the DJ Basin, there's so many people living there now that finding a surface location is so hard you can't access some places. So to the degree that you can reduce the number of surface locations is better for the community, it's better for truck traffic, it's better for all these things. So now people are drilling U-turn wells. So they'll drill 2 miles north, steer the well in a U shape, and drill it 2 miles south back to the same location. So now you've impacted twice as much acreage with a single surface hole location.
Well, it's so far above my pay grade, but I'm trying to draw like visuals of it as you were talking to see if I could understand. I think I kind of got it. Very cool though, and it goes back to something that I wanted to touch on too, which is the consumption of clean energy and energy in general versus the production. And it does seem like where technology is really adding value is how we produce the energy, how we create the energy. I mean, that's a great example of really how that's becoming so impactful and how it's keeping oil and gas at the forefront of part of the energy solution, the cleaner, more sustainable energy. It can be cleaner, it can be more sustainable than people really give it credit for. And I think it can go hand in hand with nuclear. And that's why, I was so intrigued by the oil and gas executives for nuclear initiative that you started, because it's just one example of how they all can coexist, which I think is really fascinating.
Well, and just to give you an example, I mean, I think we already talked about how you're going to see crossover from some of these companies. I'm not going to talk about any particular company, but if there's a service company who is going to get into nuclear energy, they probably didn't get into wind and solar because they understood that they probably were not going to be good for their return on their investors, and they didn't want to be tied to a bunch of subsidies. They wanted a real business that made sense on its own. So I think nuclear could give them the opportunity to do investments in those types of industries that are going to help them, and it's going to help them with their ESG score, because now there's pressure on these companies to reduce emissions, and if now 20% of their business is in clean nuclear, then all of a sudden that reduces the footprint of their ESG. They may not be doing it for that reason, but that is a good thing for them to be able to also have an alternative energy, which also happens to make money and also happens to be clean. So I think that's part of the genius of pairing nuclear with oil and gas. And Chris Wright's company used to be called Liberty Frac. And last year, I assumed that they changed the name. I should have known this wasn't true, but I just assumed they changed the name from Liberty Frac so that it wouldn't offend all the fracking haters, so we just call it Liberty Energy. And I assume that because there are so many fracking haters.
Sure.
And I assume that. But if you know Chris Wright, he would never cave in to that kind of pressure. He changed it to Liberty Energy because he said, in 10 years, we're going to be an energy company. We're not going to be a frac company. We're going to be building small modular reactors and providing that energy to run our frac fleets, but we're also going to have extra energy that we're going to sell into the grid, and extra energy that we can use to help in emergencies like Winter Storm Uri in Texas. And so we're not any longer just a frac company, we're an energy company. And so I see that could be the case for a lot of these other companies. Nuclear may not be their only industry or even their main industry, but I think it could be a significant portion of a lot of these companies' portfolio.
Well, it's cool to see everybody coexisting and working together on this. I mean, I think it's going to be fascinating in our lifetime to watch this coexistence of energy sources, how it gets produced, who's producing it. I think we're at the tip of the spear of this evolving over time. So, any last kind of parting shots you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think it's incumbent on all of us. So what you guys is doing is great. And what I've been trying to do for the last decade is pretty similar. And that is increase our energy IQ.
Mm-hmm.
Energy is so important to every aspect of our lives. We take it for granted. The average person doesn't know where electricity comes from. They think it comes from the light switch. And that doesn't make for good policy. Our policymakers need to be better educated, but so does the public, because ultimately the policymakers will ultimately do what their constituents want them to do. And if the constituents aren't knowledgeable, then they will demand bad energy policy because of virtue signaling or whatever else it is. So I think education is absolutely the key to this, and whatever we can do to bring better education to our young people, to our high school students, to our college students, to the public in general at the Thanksgiving dinner table, that is what we need to be focusing on now, is making people understand energy so that we can have better energy equals better energy policy, better energy IQ. More energy knowledge is going to enable us to make better decisions about our energy policy rather than just relying on the whims of people who make these decisions that don't really know energy is so complicated and it's so interconnected that it's really hard for the average person to understand how systemic energy is and how each of the sectors affects other sectors. You talk about the electricity grid and how complicated that is.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people have no idea. So I think energy is, for me, the rest of my life, energy education is my goal. I can't do much else, but I can hopefully move the needle on that.
Well, I think that example you used earlier in the podcast with Diablo Canyon, and it really got over the finish line with the brownouts, right? It allowed people the reality of, hey, we need this. It's not just aspirational. This is something that needs to happen now, or these are going to continue. Increasing all of our energy IQs is a worthy cause for sure. I try to do it every day. My daughter, who's 25, she constantly tells me how her friends listen to the Sprott podcast now, and they're trying to learn. And that's gratifying to know that the younger generations are thinking about this in a way that maybe they weren't 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So hopefully that will continue. And I certainly appreciate you taking the time today to talk to us on Sprott Radio.
All right, let's all remain energy sober and go out and educate it.
Great. Thank you all. And once again, I'm Ed Coyne, and thank you for listening to Sprott Radio.
This podcast is provided for information purposes only from sources believed to be reliable. However, Sprott does not warrant its completeness or accuracy. Any opinions and estimates constitute our judgment as of the date of this material and are subject to change without notice. Past performance is not indicative of future results. This communication is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any financial instrument. Any opinions and recommendations herein do not take into account individual client circumstances, objectives, or needs, and are not intended as recommendations of particular securities, financial instruments, or strategies. You must make your own independent decisions regarding any securities, financial instruments, or strategies mentioned or related to the information herein. This communication may not be redistributed or retransmitted in whole or in part, or in any form or manner without the express written consent of Sprott. Any unauthorized use or disclosure is prohibited. Receipt and review of this information constitutes your agreement not to redistribute or retransmit the contents and information contained in this communication without first obtaining express permission from an authorized officer of Sprott.